Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to Heartland Alliance International's webinar, A Rainbow Response, Working with LGBT Victims of Trafficking. This is the second webinar and second and final webinar in the series for the trafficking programs. We're so glad that you're able to join us today. Many of you probably joined us for our first session a couple weeks ago, and we're glad that you were able to participate in this follow-up webinar. For those of you who were unable to attend the first session, we will be reviewing some of the material briefly and are glad that you were able to join us this time around. Before we begin, I wanted to cover just a few housekeeping items. If at any time you experience technical difficulties with connecting to the audio portion of this webinar, you can try to log off or hang up and then log on or dial back in. Questions can be directed to ReadyTalk customer service at 1-800-843-9166. You'll note that on the left side of the bar there's a chat box, and we encourage you throughout the webinar to ask any questions that come up and just to chat them in. At the end of our presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and so we're really looking forward to responding to any of the questions that you might have regarding any of the material covered today. So yeah, please submit your questions throughout the webinar. This webinar, as well as the first webinar, will be available online at our website, www.rainbowwelcome.org, this coming week. So these slides will be made available to you along with the presentation itself. For those of you who aren't familiar with Heartland Alliance International, we are a Chicago-based, service-based human rights organization reaching populations both in the United States and in a dozen countries around the world. Our mission is to secure the rights and well-being of marginalized people and communities. The Rainbow Welcome Initiative, a project funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, supports the resettlement of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender refugees and asylees, torture survivors, unaccompanied children, and trafficking victims by offering technical assistance to service providers and disseminating resources. In addition to conducting webinars such as this one, we offer one-on-one consultation and remote technical assistance. My name is Daniel Weil, and I'm joined by my colleague Scott Portman, and together we coordinate the Rainbow Welcome Initiative, and we'll be presenting today on how to strengthen services for LGBT victims of trafficking. At the end of the presentation, we hope that you'll feel more comfortable and confident communicating to clients about issues relating to sexual orientation and gender identity, and that you know how to sensitively respond to these issues if and when a client broaches this conversation. We're also going to learn and review techniques to provide trauma-informed care to LGBT victims of trafficking, and while exploring some unique mental health considerations for LGBT victims and what can be done by service providers to ensure they have access to culturally competent and LGBT-friendly mental health services. We're also going to spend some time today looking at core services, focusing on employment counseling, housing services, and community integration, so that you all feel more prepared to address some of the particular needs of your LGBT clients, addressing their particular concerns. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time today reviewing what can be done to communicate both verbally and non-verbally acceptance to LGBT program participants. And I know we went over this a little bit in the first presentation, but based on your feedback, it seemed like it was important enough of a conversation to review it once more and to sort of elaborate on practical and concrete points that you may consider when integrating these considerations into your services. So we talked a little bit last time about why it's so difficult and challenging for LGBT clients to self-identify, and why it's, at this point, rare for victims of trafficking to disclose to their caseworkers information pertaining to their sexual orientation or their gender identity. First off, there are safety concerns that they have, and these safety concerns might relate to themselves or to their families back home. LGBT victims of trafficking might worry that by self-identifying and disclosing their LGBT status to their caseworker, that they potentially run the risk of experiencing additional discrimination at the office. If they don't know that here in the United States and at your agencies that that sort of behavior is unacceptable, that discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity is not tolerated. But some LGBT victims of trafficking might have safety concerns not so much for themselves but for their families back home. They might worry that if information about their sexual orientation or gender identity were leaked and somehow got around within the larger community, that information could potentially find its way back within their community at home in their country of origin, which could potentially put their relatives or family friends at risk. And so a major contributing factor to LGBT victims' non-disclosure is safety concerns, both for themselves and for their families back home. In the last presentation, we talked also a little bit about internalized homophobia. And what that describes is when an individual has internalizes pejorative and negative stereotypes about what it means to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And so some individuals, especially from countries in which same-sex sexual relations is condemned and is considered sinful and is a criminal offense, they often themselves begin to attach shame to who they are and have, just as the word describes, internalized the hateful messages that they received on such a regular basis. And when someone attaches shame to who they are and begins to also accept that, okay, well, who I am is wrong and is considered sinful, that will make it that much harder for them to share that information with the caseworker or with anyone, frankly. LGBT individuals also, depending on where they come from, might not share our vocabulary. Sexual orientation and gender identity are conceptualized differently throughout the world. And so what we conceptualize and understand as to be gay or might not be the same in another country. And so it's important to recognize that when working with individuals from such diverse countries and diverse backgrounds and cultures, that we might not be using the same language. And so the word itself, gay or lesbian or transgender, might not actually translate linguistically or culturally. A question that we've often fielded is, can I ask my client, can I ask my program participant if they're gay or lesbian or transgender, if I think they are, if I suspect that they're gay, is there any harm in asking them outright? And there is not a hard and fast response to this, but there are several reasons why we generally discourage providers from asking outright. As I just mentioned, your client might not be familiar with the terms that we use here in the West, and so asking a participant or client if they're gay, you might not get the response you're looking for. They might say yes, not really understanding what you mean by that, or they might say no, even though they in fact do have romantic and physical and emotional attractions to someone of the same gender. Another reason why we generally discourage staff from asking outright is because the program participant might not be ready to self-identify. They might be gay, they might be lesbian, but if they're not coming to you with that information, there might be reasons why they haven't. They might still be themselves grappling with this information or reconciling personally what it means for them to be LGBT or T. And so we wouldn't ever want to put a client in a position in which they feel pressure to self-identify if they're not at that stage where they feel comfortable doing so. That being said, as the provider, as a caseworker, you know your clients best, and so we, at the end of the day, encourage you to use your discretion. And so while these are some general guidelines as to why you might not want to ask outright, if you feel like you've established a rapport with your client, you feel like you've known them long enough that you might be able to broach that conversation in a way that feels comfortable and all right for both you and the participant, then you should feel free to do so. Again, using your best judgment as to how you might ask that question. And there are subtle ways of approaching the conversation without asking outright. You might instead hand them a flyer or brochure that talks about LGBT services in the local area and letting them know that you thought they might be interested. That sort of offers them an opportunity to say, yes, actually, I am interested in visiting the local LGBT center. And by sort of initiating the conversation that way, you aren't asking outright, nor are you placing your program participant in a position that's forcing them to respond outright, or to come out and say, yes, I'm gay, or I'm lesbian, or I'm trans. You're giving them sort of an easy out to signal to you that, yes, they are LGBT and they are interested in accessing services specific to the LGBT community. If and when a program participant does disclose, it's really important that you don't take such disclosure lightly. This could be a very important milestone in your client's life. You may potentially be the first person that your client has ever come out to. And even if you're not the first person, coming out is a lifelong process, and so disclosing one's sexual orientation or gender identity should always be acknowledged in a way that feels positive and affirming. And so if a client does come out to you and says, I'm gay or I'm transgender, you first want to thank them. Thank them for sharing, and while acknowledging the courage it took for them to share this personal and sensitive information. You also want to assure them confidentiality, since that is a primary concern for many LGBT victims of trafficking, that the information that they share with you will be confidential, that you're not going to discuss this with their relatives or other community members, but that it will stay between the two of you or other staff as necessary. If and when a program participant does self-identify and disclose, you might want to also take an opportunity to assess safety concerns, inquiring as to why they decide to share that information with you. After thanking them, it's important for you as a service provider to suss out, why did this participant disclose to me? Did they just want to let me know so that I could, did they just want to let me know because they trust me and we've established this relationship and they just thought it was a piece of them that they wanted to make known to me as their caseworker? Or is there a safety concern that they have? Are they being harassed or discriminated against by other clients or by other service providers in the local area? Or are they looking for specialized services? And so upon disclosure, while not immediately inquiring, at some point in the conversation it will be really important and helpful for you to get a sense as to why they disclosed, so that you can do your job to the best of your ability. Going off on that, again, you might want to use that time to explore potential services in the area that your participant might want to access. If there are services or organizations in the area that serve the LGBT community specifically, it's a great time for you to discuss what services are available so that those are made known to a program participant. They might be shocked to hear that there's an organization or there are services specifically for LGBT individuals, and so you want to communicate what support is available. It's important and this can't be emphasized enough, when working with LGBT clients, to not allow their sexual orientation or gender identity to absorb or cloud who they are as individuals, right? People are more than just their sexual orientation or gender identity. People who identify as straight are rarely perceived and categorized solely based on their attractions to people of the opposite sex. And we want to be sure that the same goes for LGBT individuals, that we don't forget when working with them and supporting them that their needs and their strengths and their passions extend beyond how they identify and who they love. Okay. And so there are ways, and we started to review this in the first presentation, there are ways that you and your colleagues can demonstrate and signify support to the LGBT community so that your program participants feel more comfortable coming forward with this information. You can use inclusive language when interacting with them. So if you're having a conversation with a client, not to assume the gender to which they're attracted. So instead of asking your female client if they have a boyfriend or if they have a husband or what their relationship history is, asking whether they have a partner. Again, so we're not assuming how they identify because that question could result in the client thinking, okay, my staff or my caseworker thinks that I'm straight and expects me to be straight. That's going to make it a lot harder for her to correct you and for her to say, actually, no, I have a girlfriend, or no, I've never had a boyfriend, I'm actually a lesbian. So we talked a little bit about that in the last presentation, but what we didn't mention was that in addition to ensuring inclusivity in your verbal interactions with program participants, there are also opportunities for you to create a more inclusive environment through your forms, through your documents that you share with participants. We encourage you to take a look at your intake forms and see what questions are listed and how they're listed. And so if you're asking for the sex or for the gender of a client, rather than just listing male and female, you might also want to include trans. Again, that will significantly help any participant walking through your doors understand and know that, okay, if I am transgender, if I identify as trans, then this place is supportive of my identity and will not discriminate against me because of how I identify. There are also other ways in which you can subtly demonstrate support that don't require any verbal communication, or written communication for that matter. Putting up a rainbow flag in your office can really actually do wonders for making LGBT clients feel comfortable and welcomed. The rainbow flag, although a symbol originating in the West, has over time become a globally recognized symbol for the LGBT community. And so chances are LGBT victims of trafficking will know what the rainbow flag signifies. And just seeing that rainbow flag will make it that much easier for them to share with you information about their sexual orientation or gender identity. We had a local partner in Miami, a local affiliate that works with refugees and victims of trafficking, and they put up a rainbow flag in their office, and staff also put up stickers in their cubes with either a rainbow flag or a sticker that said, "I'm an ally," or "discrimination-free zone." And it was pretty remarkable, the spike in the number of self-identifying clients they served after doing so. And so it's a small, really easy, cost-effective way to dramatically transform how an LGBT victim of trafficking feels and experiences the inclusivity that you're trying to offer at your agencies. Just a really quick note on restroom facilities, again, because when thinking about how we can make the physical environment more inclusive and sensitive to LGBT individuals' concerns, it's important for us to just note that for transgender participants, they may or may not feel comfortable going to the restroom depending on a number of variables and factors. Some transgender individuals might feel comfortable going to the restroom of the gender of which they identify. Others may not. If your agency has a single occupancy restroom, that in many cases is preferable, again, because transgender individuals won't feel like their safety is at risk if they choose to use the restroom of the gender of which they identify. We recognize that's not always feasible, though, but it's just important to think about and consider what sort of creative solutions you and your colleagues might be able to come up with so that trans participants feel safe and feel welcomed. I'm going to hand it over to Scott right now, who's going to talk a little bit about providing trauma-informed care to LGBT victims of trafficking.
Well, this is Scott Portman. I understand that most of the time the mental health services provided by the victims of trafficking programs are dealt with through referrals to other agencies. So I'm going to try to focus more on the role of case management and sort of an understanding of what some of the issues might be that you might face during intake and during sort of, doing the kind of overall coordination of services for victims of trafficking. One of the main issues is that victims of trafficking in general tend to lack a support structure. That's one of the reasons why oftentimes they're trafficked in the first place. They may not have a strong support structure of family or friends, and that may place them at the sort of risk and the sort of need for employment that puts them in a situation where they're later exploited. But particularly in the case of LGBT victims of trafficking and LGBT persons generally, there's a distinction to be made, or at least a concept to be understood. And that's sometimes if there's a lack of family support, if the families have separated themselves, if the LGBT victim of trafficking does no longer have a relationship with the family of origin, very often LGBT people form families of choice. In this country, there's of course an increasing movement toward recognizing same-sex relationships, but around the world this may not be the case. And in the absence of other family, LGBT persons form very close bonds not only with partners, but also with friends in the community and also with others. And this can sometimes be a difficult situation because some of the substitutes for families, or some of the families of choice that are then developed, can end up being exploitative. And I know that you know about situations where perhaps a victim of sex trafficking might have an ongoing relationship with somebody involved in their exploitation at some point in time. This can also be the same thing for LGBT victims of trafficking. And so the lack of family support structures complicates the response, and it can be doubly complicated when it comes to LGBT individuals. Okay. The other issue, which Daniel already brought up, is the issue of internalized homophobia, which, as he mentioned, is negative feelings toward oneself due to internalization of negative beliefs that are in the culture. But the effect on mental health can be the combination of shame and lowered self-esteem and self-blaming. And as you know, when you work with victims of trafficking, a lot of times people blame themselves for being trafficked. How could I be so stupid to put myself into this situation? Well, this is also, again, can be compounded with LGBT victims of trafficking because they can blame themselves for their sexual orientation, or they can internalize the belief that there's something inherently wrong with them or disordered about them that put them into this situation. And from this sort of self-blame comes shame and the potential for self-harm, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it can also include anger toward others in the community, in the LGBT community, or anger toward others, other members of their own immigrant community as well, particularly if they suffered a lot of abuse from people within their own community before coming to the United States. So, one of the mental health, LGBT populations in the United States tend to have a slightly elevated risk of substance use and addictions. Now, I want to be clear that this is not something inherent to being LGBT, but rather a reflection of all these other stressors that LGBT persons face. But you should be aware, and I presume that most of you do screen for substance use during health screening and during other sorts of intake processes with victims of trafficking. I think it's especially important with LGBT trafficking victims. It's usually best done in the context of healthcare because people can ask rather sensitive questions directly in the context of health, and sometimes by placing it in the health context, it's easier to elicit an honest or direct answer, but not necessarily. I think case managers should feel free to ask about substance use in a non-shaming way. And also, it's, of course, you will need to bring up issues of legal risks, particularly for people that are in the process of obtaining immigration status, particularly if the substances that are being used are substances that are illegal in the United States. So typically, trafficking programs work with lawyers. So I think it's important to kind of work together with the lawyer and urgent to address substance use in a supportive way that doesn't blame or shame the individual, but that covers your bases in case there's legal risks. Another issue as far as substance use is that many 12-step programs, there may be 12-step programs that are culturally appropriate. There may be, for example, for the Latino communities in the United States, but they may not be appropriate for LGBT persons. That LGBT persons may fear and face the same stigma and discrimination within 12-step programs. So it's a good idea, and we'll emphasize this throughout this presentation, it's a good idea to be proactive before you get a case. Find out if there's LGBT programs for substance use in your community. You might want to connect this also with LGBT health providers, and to make sure that there's an appropriate 12-step provider, for example, or 12-step program, if that's relevant. LGBT persons, trafficking victims in general, have an elevated risk of exposure to trauma or sexual abuse, but it's particularly the case with LGBT persons. When you screen, and you should screen for trauma history, it's okay actually to ask directly about traumatic history of trauma. Sometimes the best way to do that is to preface the conversation by saying, as part of our conversation today, we have to talk about some really difficult things. I'm sorry to have to talk about this, but these are the reasons why we need to ask these things. And then to ask them rather directly. So you can ask directly, was there sexual assault? Were you sexually assaulted? And it's kind of a myth that people don't want to discuss these things. Many times people very much do. But sometimes also you have to be very, very aware of triggers that might cause a person to experience, an overwhelming emotion, a flashback, some other sort of reaction to traumatic content. So the important thing with any sort of screening for trauma is to organize the interview in a way that provides the victim of trafficking with maximum control over the interview. So, for one thing, you might want to ask about, if you think that there's a history of trauma or if you're doing an intake interview, you might want to ask about what gender the worker would be more comfortable and more appropriate. Usually we think a female victim of sexual assault is most comfortable talking to a woman, and normally that's the case. But it can be very different with LGBT persons and really with anybody, I suppose. So a male victim of sexual assault may feel more comfortable talking to a female caseworker or another male caseworker. It's just that gender matters, and it's good to ask these questions about who they're most comfortable talking with. It's also good to structure the interview in a way that people can take breaks, and structure the interview in a way where the person doesn't feel like they're being interrogated. So, creating a space where there's perhaps three persons in the room, the interpreter, the provider, and the client, all sort of facing each other, not behind a desk. Also, of course, very important to discuss confidentiality and the limits to confidentiality. Okay, so there is a risk of self-harm. This is particularly acute with teenagers, but LGBT persons also, because of the challenges that they face, have a higher risk of suicide. Now, we sort of did a little bit of polling to find out whether the trafficking programs do suicide intervention and crisis management training, and I think most do more or less. But I think it's good to just sort of revisit the issue a little bit. When assessing suicide risk, again, you want to be aware of language and behavior. If a person starts describing a desire to no longer be alive or says something casually, I wish I were dead, again, with suicide, just as the case with trauma, it's okay to ask things directly. It's okay to ask directly, are you planning on hurting yourself, or are you planning on killing yourself? And then follow up those questions and ask them very directly. And be also looking for nonverbal signs, like if a person starts to be giving things away, or if a person suddenly, if a person who's been extremely depressed, sometimes strangely enough, becomes kind of elated or kind of, or their sort of aspect changes suddenly. Things like giving things away, things like saying goodbye to people in different ways. Even if there's no mention of suicide, you need to be very, very aware of this and bring up these issues and say, I noticed that there's been some changes with you. Is everything okay? If somebody expresses a desire to commit suicide, it needs to be taken as an emergency, and it needs to be discussed immediately. And one needs to assess whether the person has a plan to commit suicide and the means to commit suicide. And most importantly, any threat of suicide needs to be shared with other workers. It really needs to be dealt with on a team basis. And then, there needs to be a creation of a safety plan and possibly even hospitalization. So a lot of times, maybe it's not something significant, but that's much better discussed in a team, and it's much better if everybody on the team has an awareness, even if there's only casual mention and the person doesn't really have a plan. Other forms of self-harm. Actually, we probably don't have time to get into that today, but a lot of times with history of sexual assault, including with LGBT persons, there can be issues of cutting or other forms of self-harm. Obviously, if you see anything like that, it's time for a mental health referral. So, as a case manager, and again, this is probably old hat to most of you, but most of you probably know what the concept of active listening is. It means listening closely to what people say, maintaining eye contact, affirming what they say, saying, okay, I understand this, or asking supportive questions or open-ended questions, and just expressing honesty with them as you're communicating with them, so that they know that it's really a two-way street. I think one of the issues to encourage trust is transparency. Preview the meeting to reduce the anxiety about what the meeting will be. You can talk about what the purpose of the meeting is, why you're asking them these questions, how long the meeting will be. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a victim of trafficking loses control over so much in his or her life. They no longer have control over their work, sometimes over their bodies, sometimes certainly over their choices. So the central strategy in any anti-trafficking program, including for LGBT persons, is to restore that agency. So allowing people the choices of where to sit and what to do during any sort of interaction is really, really important. Okay. Now, we'll talk a little bit. Part of the work of a caseworker has to do with responding, reinforcing what a mental health provider might. We'll talk in a second about what to look for as far as providers and how to make a referral. But I did want to just mention the term cognitive behavioral strategies and how that might impact caseworkers. Victims of trafficking have so many negative thoughts about themselves, often do, and are prey to depression and negative thoughts and feelings and emotions that tend to reinforce each of them tends to reinforce the other. So it's kind of important for caseworkers, if they don't already know it, to read up a little bit and to be prepared to redirect and refocus these negative thoughts or cognitions. To identify unhealthy, inaccurate, or negative thoughts, to reinforce how this thinking influences feelings and then behaviors, and to kind of help divert or address directly some of these issues as they come up when one is doing case management. So go to the next slide. So this is just a little triangle of the way, just a diagram of the way that feelings and thoughts and behaviors reinforce each other. But of course, if you've got an individual who's seriously depressed, or if there's a risk of suicide, or just generally, most trafficking victims programs do provide a referral to mental health services. So let's talk a little bit about how that works and what specifically you need to know when trying to make a referral for an LGBT client. First off, stigma of mental health services is high among virtually everybody, but it can be worse among LGBT persons. They may fear judgment or exposure In particular, they may fear reparative therapies. In a lot of the world, being gay is still cause for being treated, and still treated as some sort of not just a moral problem, but a medical and psychological problem. So people that do realize that they're LGBT or T and are somewhat comfortable with that and don't want to be treated for that may rebel against any chance of being sent to mental health services because they may expect in this country that there will be pressure upon them to change. The other issue, of course, is that people may interpret the problems that they're facing as spiritual matters or punishment for a perceived offense or sin. And so, as you know, not to contradict religious or cultural beliefs, but to emphasize help-seeking behavior. And also, of course, to reassure confidentiality. Now, one has to be very open and honest about confidentiality because if there is a risk of self-harm, people do need to know that information no longer becomes privileged. That if a person is at risk of suicide, that the individual has to intervene and that information has to be shared. So there are limits to confidentiality, but a direct conversation about confidentiality is always important when making a referral for mental health services. Some of the messages that we find that are useful to convey, people object to mental health services because either they think that somebody will try to cure their sexual orientation or gender identity, or they already have concerns about they may feel that their sexual orientation or gender identity is some sort of a disorder. But some of the messages to convey to diminish stigma include that symptoms of traumatic stress or the symptoms that they're feeling are natural responses to unnatural events and not an illness or a moral failing. Traumatic stress has effects on the brain. PTSD and depression do cause organic changes to the brain, but they're not precisely mental illnesses. They're more responses to traumatic events. The other thing to emphasize is that depression and anxiety are treatable. Seeking treatment makes it easier to make one's goals, which might include keeping employment or pursuing education, or even adequately assisting in their own defense as they go through the legal process to get a T visa. Some other appropriate messages that you might give are that mental health services are intended to help improve people's well-being, not just to get rid of a problem. So it's important to sort of describe the purpose and role of mental health services in this society versus where they might have come from. Also, to reemphasize that mental health services are not considered shameful and that they're common. And that mental health professionals are also required to keep information confidential, and specifically that they won't judge a person because of sexual orientation or gender identity. And typically that they have some understanding of sexual orientation or gender identity. And so it's not an issue that the person needs to be scared about discussing with the mental health provider. Now, one of the problems that trafficking programs might face, it's difficult enough to find culturally competent mental health providers, especially those that have background with trauma. It's even more difficult, perhaps, to find somebody that has specific expertise in sexual orientation or gender identity. So how does one balance the importance of finding somebody with multicultural competence versus sexual orientation and gender identity competence? There's not really a good answer to that, but I think that as a minimum standard, the American Psychological Association has about 20 different sort of standards that persons who provide mental health services to LGBT people should adhere to. I've sort of condensed and combined a few of the most important ones. And I think it's a worthwhile discussion with your mental health providers to make sure that they adhere to these before you make a referral. And also in some situations, you may want to just refer to somebody with LGBT expertise, not necessarily multicultural expertise, although you may need to help as far as helping that person manage how to work with an interpreter. So first, a mental health professional who's going to serve LGBT persons needs to be aware and sensitive to the effects of stigma on an individual. They need to fully embrace that sexual orientation or gender identity, same-sex sexual orientation or non-gender typical gender identity are not mental illnesses but normal variation. And they need to reject attempts to cure them because there's no scientific basis for curing either of these. They need to be able to distinguish between gender identity and sexual orientation and not just lump them all in together. And that within the LGBT community, there's diversity in terms of response to society and response to culture, and that each of the different communities may have specific and different mental health needs. Very importantly, and this goes for case managers, but particularly for mental health providers as well, they need to understand the importance, the sort of central importance of families of choice. And that there may be a lot of issues with an LGBT person and their family of origin. And also, it's worth understanding, even among immigrant LGBT persons, that HIV and AIDS does have an impact on the LGBT community, even if only to increase stigma. Okay. So, trafficking programs, as torture treatment programs and refugee programs as well, all focus on improving the resilience of the victims of trafficking or the refugee or the asylum seeker. And it's just worth ending the mental health section on that note, that all of that taking a client-centered approach and a strengths-based approach leads toward greater resilience. Now I'll hand it back over to Daniel to talk a little bit about housing.
Okay. So many of your clients will, because of limited resources, will not necessarily be able to find long-term housing in an apartment or a house, at least right away. Many of them might be placed in temporary shelters. What's important to know when working with LGBT victims of trafficking is that a lot of shelters are unequipped to provide services to LGBT residents. Sometimes we find that staff are not necessarily culturally competent and are insensitive to the unique needs of LGBT individuals. And so we've found some LGBT individuals, when placed in shelters, experience discrimination and harassment from staff at the shelter. More typical is that LGBT individuals in shelters will experience discrimination and will be bullied by other residents. And staff might not necessarily understand their role in responding to or preventing violence, or how to make the shelter safe for LGBT individuals so that they're not experiencing violence or aggression or verbal harassment when residing at the shelter. For victims of trafficking more generally, being placed in a shelter can be triggering. This is especially true for LGBT victims of trafficking who are being asked to share quarters, really close quarters with individuals, some who might be from the same country of origin, who are intolerant of LGBT individuals. And so it could be even more difficult for an LGBT victim to be placed in a shelter if they continue to feel unsafe in their physical environment. And that's the bottom line, that for LGBT individuals, that when placed in shelters, safety is an ongoing concern, and that some LGBT individuals will elect to live on the streets rather than live in a shelter because they feel more safe, which you might find surprising because we know it's not all that safe to live on the streets as well, but many LGBT individuals feel more safe on their own, living on the streets, than they do in a shelter, in an enclosed environment. There are elevated concerns, of course, for transgender individuals for a couple of reasons. The first of which is transgender individuals may not be able to pass as easily as lesbian individuals or gay men or bisexual individuals. And what I mean by pass is that you might have a gay client who is perceived as straight by other community members. And so you could have a gay client who lives in a shelter and remain pretty discreet. The other residents, the other staff, they don't know that he's gay. For transgender individuals who present and express their gender, which may not correspond to their sex assigned at birth, it might be easier for both residents and staff and community members to identify them as transgender. And so they're already placed at an increased risk because they're not necessarily able to conceal their identity in the same way that LG and B individuals are. That said, there's also the concern about where transgender individuals are placed. If you're working with a transgender woman, so that means you're working with a client who is biologically born male but who identifies and presents as a woman, she might be forced to reside in a shelter for men. Or vice versa, you might work with a transgender man who is asked to live in a shelter for women, even though he identifies as a man. And so transgender individuals in particular have concerns about where they're placed in shelters and if they'll be at increased risk of violence. What can you do? Well, it's important to consult your client and trust your client. Your program participants will be best placed and positioned to assess their own safety and comfort level. Even though some of their concerns might be subjective, so you might have a client who reports to you that they feel unsafe in the shelter, in a particular shelter. And maybe they're not at risk. Maybe the staff is actually really friendly and there have been no issues relating to the other residents. However, if the participant feels unsafe, it's important not only to honor those concerns, even if they're subjective, but if they're coming to you and telling you that they are unsafe, chances are they are. They are the best judges of their safety, and if they've assessed an environment to be unsafe and feel like their physical safety is at risk, then it's important that you take those concerns seriously and identify alternative accommodations. As Scott said, even before you are working with LGBT clients, it's important to do the legwork so that you're prepared to effectively and adequately respond when a client does disclose. And so some of those proactive measures that you can take include identifying safe shelters, identifying which shelters in your local area are LGBT friendly or have received training on LGBT issues, so that you can assure that when placing a client in a shelter that they're going to be looked out for, that the staff will be attentive and responsive to any needs that they have, and that bullying and discrimination against LGBT individuals is non-existent. This is also an opportunity for your programs to develop joint advocacy strategies and cultivate relationships with other local organizations, specifically LGBT organizations. LGBT individuals are disproportionately homeless than straight people. While LGBT individuals might only make up roughly 5% of the population, 40% of homeless individuals, in particular youth, identify as LGBT or T. And so homelessness is a huge concern of the LGBT community. And so this is an opportunity for trafficking programs and LGBT organizations to identify common ground and work together to increase access to shelter services for LGBT individuals, and to raise the standard of services that LGBT individuals face, or raise the standard of services LGBT individuals have access to in shelters. In terms of identifying longer-term housing for your LGBT clients, if you're helping them identify an apartment, it's important that you do take into consideration the safety of the neighborhood. In the last presentation, we talked quite extensively about the violence that LGBT individuals experience overseas, and we'd be remiss in this presentation if we didn't highlight the violence that LGBT individuals, both U.S. citizens and non-native U.S. Individuals, experience here in our own country. In 2011, the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs reported that there were 30 bias-based murders against LGBT individuals throughout the country. And just in the news, I think, just in the last several months, we've seen murders of LGBT individuals, including a couple in New York City, which is obviously known to be a safe haven and welcoming place for LGBT community members. And so even in the most progressive pockets where there's a thriving and vibrant LGBT community, they remain at risk of violence. And so it's important that when searching for housing and when looking at neighborhoods, to do your due diligence in sort of identifying where LGBT clients might be safer, where there are less incidents of hate crimes being reported. If an LGBT client of yours is harassed or is a victim of a crime here in the United States, a victim of a hate crime, then you might also find yourself in a position to mediate for the participant with local authorities. LGBT individuals, especially LGBT victims of trafficking, might not feel comfortable going to the police. Transgender individuals especially, since they are often targeted by police and accused of being prostitutes and sometimes arrested and detained on no grounds other than how they're presenting themselves. In 2012, also the same coalition, the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, found that trans people were 4 times more likely to face police violence than people who don't identify as transgender. And so transgender individuals actually have real concerns for when interacting with the police. And so especially when working with transgender clients, they might be looking to you to serve as a mediator when approaching the police. When looking for roommates, if your clients are looking for roommates, it's just important to identify roommates who will be supportive of their sexual orientation and gender identity. We've found that members who are of the same country of origin are probably going to have a more difficult time living with LGBT individuals, and that the LGBT client is at greater risk of harm or just at a greater risk of experiencing continued persecution or harassment. And so if you're unable to identify another LGBT client to house your program participant with, we recommend housing them with another client from a different country of origin. We found that there's often there's this perception that there is less of a threat to the individual's culture and community if the LGBT individual is not from the same background and same country, which is why we recommend housing LGBT individuals with members of different countries of origin. When also sort of thinking about devising housing strategies for LGBT program participants, this again is another opportunity to coordinate with other local agencies, of course while respecting the privacy of the clients. You don't want to out your client to another agency or to another participant if that hasn't been approved by the client, him or herself, if you haven't received consent. We also understand that ICE might have some discretionary funding, but that it's often not utilized. And this might be a point of advocacy and a pressure point on ICE to increase funding support for victims of trafficking when working with LGBT victims of trafficking, who, of course, represent a vulnerable population within an already very vulnerable population. If you're coming against and experiencing challenges identifying housing options or appealing to other resources to supplement any funding that you currently have available, we encourage you to contact your regional coordinator because they might be able to provide additional support and connect you to appropriate resources.
Well, issues of employment are usually sensitive for trafficking victims, of any sort of trafficking victim, just because of their history of having been exploited. But LGBT victims of trafficking, there may be some special concerns. One, workplace discrimination and harassment. Another would be the appropriateness or necessity of disclosing one's sexual orientation or gender identity in different spheres of life, including in the workplace. And finally, the appropriateness of potential employment opportunities. Each of these need to be taken into consideration if you have an LGBT trafficking victim. Now, this little continuum should probably go from hypersensitivity on the one end to failure to act or notify on the other. But an LGBT victim of trafficking may not respond to harassment or abuse at work, or may be extremely sensitive to it. LGBT victims of trafficking may not report abuse because they may fear disclosure, or they may think that abuse is legal in the United States, or they may not recognize abuse as abuse because perhaps they've just had to live through this harassment in the workplace for a very, very long time in their country of origin. Or they may just not know the ground rules to what's appropriate in the workplace in the United States and what's not. LGBT victims of trafficking could be excessively sensitive to anything that appears to be workplace harassment or discrimination due to past history and triggers. And they may not recognize that discrimination against them for their sexual orientation or gender identity is actually legal in many jurisdictions in the United States. So, let's go to the next one. So how do you start a discussion about employment with an LGBT victim of trafficking? The same as any victim of trafficking, being sensitive to the participants' concerns, assessing and honoring boundaries, and really, especially talking about the appropriateness of employment, especially for transgender individuals. A lot of times transgender individuals can't work very openly or freely in areas where they come into contact with the public if it's a situation where they might be subjected to abuse from the public. In other situations, maybe they can. A lot of times LGBT victims of trafficking really don't want to be working in a workplace with many other immigrants, especially from their own community. And sometimes, it requires a lot of sort of careful assessment, both of skills and of comfort level, and the ability for an LGBT person to either be out or not, or disclose or not disclose, or somehow, to the extent to which their identity can be easily determined by others around them, to find the most comfortable workplace for them. So when you're assessing potential workplaces for LGBT victims of trafficking, again, we can't emphasize it enough. You should be proactive to identify LGBT-friendly companies and businesses in advance. They're out there. And especially with employment, this is a really good way for trafficking programs to find new allies in the community. If you reach out to LGBT-friendly companies and businesses, they're likely to be the same businesses that are immigrant-friendly, or at least diversity-friendly. And they may be the sorts of employers that will be able to understand some of the challenges that your clients might have gone through, either gay or straight, before arriving in the United States or after arriving in the United States, and make some accommodation. So it's a good idea, even before you get your first LGBT client, it's a really good idea to reach out to LGBT-friendly companies or LGBT-run companies, for that matter. And you also want to investigate the employer's policies and procedures. Most employers have got policies and procedures for workplace sexual harassment because of liability issues, because it's just necessary. But many don't have anti-discrimination policies for LGBT persons, or many don't sort of affirmatively make sure that LGBT people are made aware that they're welcome in the workplace. So after placing somebody, there's a number of different post-employment activities that trafficking programs should probably do, and especially focus on with LGBT individuals. One of the issues is a check-in on safety in the workplace, whether the person feels safe and secure, and if not, what's the basis for that? And really a sensitive sort of trying to understand what's subjective fear and what's objective fear. Another thing to reinforce with LGBT trafficking victims in the workplace is that disclosure of sexual orientation and gender identity is not an all or nothing issue. It doesn't mean that people have to disclose to everybody in their lives, and it doesn't have to be that they have to disclose in every sphere of life. So it may make sense to disclose in the workplace, or a person may want to or may not fear doing that, but it may not make sense, particularly in states or in jurisdictions where there's no anti-discrimination laws in place. So sometimes LGBT victims of trafficking might need some counseling or assistance or help in trying to negotiate how they deal with their sexual orientation or gender identity in the public sphere, including in employment. Also, a lot of times it's good to kind of go over and discuss what sexual harassment is and what discrimination is. Sexual harassment consists of unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that creates a hostile or offensive work environment. And, a lot of times LGBT people have always faced a hostile or offensive work environment and may not recognize that there are protections against that here. So it's important to kind of talk about what the work environment is, if people if there's anything going on at work where there's acknowledgement of their sexual orientation or gender identity in a negative way, any sort of harassment. Also importantly, sexual harassment can include harassment based on imputed sexual orientation. So you may have straight victims of trafficking who are subjected to sexual harassment by same-sex individuals in the workplace who are themselves straight. So, for example, a lot of jokes about being gay and a lot of harassment, a lot of physical sort of jostling and behavior that can take place in some workplaces. This can be sexual harassment even against trafficking victims who are imputed to be LGBT or T. We'll look at I'm going to hand over to Daniel now, and he's going to talk a little bit about community integration.
Thanks, Scott. While it's more apparent that your agencies are responsible for providing the services already discussed in this presentation, mental health services, employment counseling, housing services, it might be less clear what your role is in helping your participants to integrate within the community. And because there's such a short window that you have when working with your clients, and as you know better than anyone else, that there's only so much support that you as a caseworker or as you as an agency can offer to any one victim of trafficking. It's so important and vital to connect your program participants to additional resources, to external resources, and other organizations who will be able to supplement the critical services that you provide. This is especially important for LGBT victims of trafficking because, unlike other trafficking victims, are at an increased risk of experiencing continued isolation. I'll read this quote out quickly. It came from a Ugandan program participant who identifies as a lesbian. She said, "It's hard to tell someone who you really are. I have to hide who I am. I don't get to be myself. The hardest part about being here is finding people to talk freely with." And so LGBT victims of trafficking, in addition to facing the stigma for being a victim of trafficking, the stigma they face for being new arrivals to this country, they face stigma as LGBT individuals, and so they might not have the same connections to members of their own ethnic or national community because they are discriminated against within those communities, or because they are uncomfortable being around members of their ethnic or national communities as a result of safety concerns. And so there is an opportunity to help LGBT victims of trafficking tap into alternative networks. The first and perhaps the most obvious is LGBT community. LGBT community members can really help LGBT victims of trafficking feel like they have a support system that they might not get from members of their country of origin, a support system that your agency might not necessarily be able to facilitate. It's also important for LGBT individuals who are experiencing internalized homophobia to be around other LGBT people who are successful and have thrived, who have families, who are comfortable with their own identities, because that will help affirm your clients' identities as well. LGBT organizations also can offer health services, that both mental health and physical health services that are catered to the LGBT community, as well as offering recreational activities and other case management services tailored to the needs of LGBT individuals. There are some obstacles, though, that you should be aware of when outreaching to LGBT organizations. There might be an issue of language capacity. LGBT organizations might not have, and often don't have, the language capacities, of course, that your programs do. And so you might have a client who speaks Burmese, and no one from the LGBT organization speaks that language, and they're unable to provide interpretive services. And so that's one pretty significant barrier that you might need to get around. In addition to the cultural differences, we've worked with LGBT clients some of whom have felt really comfortable and welcomed accessing services at the local LGBT organization, and others who've come back reported saying that they felt marginalized within the LGBT community. They felt ignored. They felt like they were neglected because they weren't Americans, because they speak differently or they look different. And so that's something that you might need to work around with your program participants, and also maybe something to prepare them for. It can be pretty discouraging for an LGBT client to go to the local center feeling really excited about what this will mean for them and that this will be their new community, to only find that they still don't feel like it's a safe space for them. And that sort of brings me to my next point, that LGBT organizations, while potentially incredible and valuable resource for LGBT victims of trafficking, may not work for everyone. And it might not be what all of your LGBT clients are seeking. Some of them might not feel comfortable or not have a strong desire to link up to and tap into an LGBT network or community. And so it's important for you to explore that with your program participants. Are they looking to connect to LGBT individuals? Do they have other hobbies or interests that aren't at all relating or relative to the LGBT community that you could help them connect to? So I realize we're a little bit over our allotted hour already. I did want to respond quickly to a question that came in. I think it's a really great question. I'll read the question first. Most of our clients communicate with caseworkers through an interpreter. Many languages assign gender to partners, such as novio or novia or esposo or esposa in Spanish. How could a caseworker use more gender-neutral language within the constraints of the client's native language? That's a great question. Our recommendation is if you have interpreters on staff, or if you contract interpretive services out, that you provide sensitivity training to anyone providing interpretive services, so that the interpreters understand that when providing interpretive services, when working with your program participants and with staff, that it's important that they use gender-neutral language, regardless of who the client is. And so even if you are working with a client who you assume to be straight, or who the interpreter assumes to be straight, that it's necessary for them to continue to use gender-neutral language, to sort of integrate that into your policies when working with interpreters.
I just want to echo what Daniel says. It's so important to train the interpreters, because they may, and in some cases very likely do have biases against LGBT persons, particularly if they are themselves recent arrivals in the United States. The other thing is, it's a good idea, if you've got certain languages that are being used frequently, to find out what the more polite terms are and what the more abusive terms are for LGBT. So, for example, we had a situation not long ago where actually, a transgender Arabic interpreter interpreted gay as sodomite. And that was kind of an issue, and that was with us, and we had to kind of correct that and work on that. So people may use language that's not good, even if they are open to LGBT persons intolerant. So it's not only important to talk about sensitivity with your interpreters, but also to talk about word choice in their specific idiom.
Thanks, Scott. There have been a few questions coming in about how whether these materials will be made available online, and yes, they will. Both the first presentation and this one will be made available on our website, rainbowwelcome.org, later this week, and so we encourage you to to visit our website, to take a look at the presentations, to share with your staff who were unable to participate in these sessions. And please be in touch if any additional questions come up. If we're available for general consultation. If you have any additional questions that come up between now and a few weeks from now or whenever, feel free to come to us if you have any general questions, or if you're working with the LGBT client and you would like consultation on a particular case. That's what we're here for. Thanks so much for your participation. Thanks for all the incredible and really important work that you do on behalf of victims of trafficking. And please be in touch and take care.
Thank you.